They strung her up by her ankles at dawn barefoot and bloodied like meat left to drain. The sign beneath her read, "Thief," painted crooked in red over cracked wood, and the wind slapped it sideways every few seconds as if ashamed. Her name was Rhea, though no one in that town said it aloud anymore. She hadn't stolen food or cloth or coin, but herbs, wild ones, roots used for healing and breath. The preacher's wife had fallen ill, and Rhea had left a bundle at the doorstep, unpaid, unasked, but recognized by scent. That's when they came for her. Said she'd cursed the woman, instead said the plants were savage tricks, said she was lucky they weren't burning her. So now she hung from the hitching post outside the saloon, wrists tied behind her back, chin tipping toward the dirt, dark hair dragging through dust and blood. No one looked at her long. A few drunkards jeered. A child tugged her mother's dress and asked, "Why's that lady upside down?" The mother said, "Because she broke the law." But the law in Hollow Creek changed, like the weather cruel, when it felt watch silent, when no one cared. Sheriff Dodd hadn't said a word, just nodded as the blacksmith hoisted the rope and beside the post tied up and still stood the town's finest horse, Marshall's prize Palomino Sable. Big, gold-coated, proud-chested, twitching with the scent of morning fire and stale beer. They tried to lead him away once the punishment began, but he wouldn't budge. Not for the whip, not for grain, not even when the marshal hissed curses and yanked the reins. Sable stayed still as a statue head turned toward Rhea's swinging form, ears pinned back. "Damned beasts broken," someone muttered. But by mid-morning, when the dust had stilled and the crowd thinned out, it was clear the only one not turning away from her was the animal. And in that quiet, something shifted. Not a rescue, not forgiveness, just a stillness too solid to ignore. Rhea, bruised and half-conscious, blinked against the blood sliding into her eyes. She saw hooves, she heard breathing. And she felt somewhere deep beneath the ache and rope burn, the strange beginning of a standoff that wasn't hers to start, but just might end with her feet on the ground. By afternoon, Rhea's face had swollen on one side, and her lips cracked from the heat. No one had come to give her water. No one dared. She was already a shadow, already branded, already counted out. But Sable had not moved. His great body was still fixed beside her tail, swishing only when flies gathered too bold. Marshal Greeley, red in the face, had tried again, first with salt, then with threats. "Move, you bastard," he growled, slapping the reins hard against the Palomino's flank. The horse only flinched once, then planted his hooves deeper into the dirt, his wide black eyes steady on Rhea's bruised ribs. "He's bewitched," the marshal spat, stepping back in disgust. Damn thing's got Apache blood now. But that's when the town started watching. Not the girl, but the animal. It was the first time they'd noticed the way Sable stood. Not like a creature chained, but like a guardian set in place by something older than law. People whispered behind corners. He didn't even do this at the county fair. Wouldn't budge when the preacher came near either. By evening, even the barkeep's wife wandered out with a rag and a glance over her shoulder. She didn't untie Rhea. She didn't speak. She just dabbed at the blood on the girl's neck with a trembling hand, as if trying to clean a sin off her own fingers. She helped my boy once the woman mumbled to no one with his cough. Then she walked away, and no one stopped her. That night, as the street lamps flickered on and the town grew quiet, the wind changed, not stronger, just sharper, like it remembered something. Rhea floated between fever and lucidity, hearing voices like ghosts around her, and always the slow rhythm of breath beside her left ear. Hooves, straw horse sweat. That scent, wild and warm, more familiar than anything else now. She dreamed of a woman singing in a language she once knew, but had forgotten how to speak a name, repeated in that song. Rhea, Rhea, Rhea. By midnight, a child left a crust of bread on the ground beneath her, then ran off before his mother could see. The rope creaked, her ribs throbbed, but something small and invisible had cracked in Hollow Creek. And it wasn't her spine. When dawn broke, Sable was still there. Same position, same eyes fixed on the woman whose body hung limp like wind-torn cloth. But now his stance felt louder, like a question no one could answer. Marshall Greeley hadn't slept. He paced the boardwalk all night, grumbling about curses and women and broken beasts. "Hang a witch, the devil sends a horse," he muttered, boots clunking harder with every pass. But he didn't touch Rhea again, didn't order another lashing. Because now the eyes weren't just on her, they were on him. Even the blacksmith who'd tied the rope had stopped making eye contact. "She's still breathing," someone asked near the general store. "She's still human," someone else muttered. But it was old Saul Briggs who broke the silence. Saul, who hadn't spoken a word in 3 years since the railroad took his son, shuffled out with a rusted tin can of water and walked straight to Rhea. No hat, no fanfare. He lifted the can, soaked the edge of his sleeve, and touched the damp cloth gently to her lips. She stirred barely, but enough for Saul to nod once, like he'd just agreed to something unspoken. "They hanged my boy for less," he whispered, and he left the rest unsaid. The town didn't riot. No one stormed the sheriff's office, but no one stopped Saul either, or the girl who came at noon and left a shawl on the fence post beside Rhea's rope, or the school teacher who muttered, "She's been up long enough," but didn't say it loud. And still the horse remained. When Greeley finally threw his hands in the air, it wasn't to surrender to the woman, it was to the animal. "Fine, let him rot there with her," he bellowed. But by sunset, the preacher's wife, the very one Rhea had been accused of cursing, walked slowly down Main Street, her skin pale but upright, no longer coughing. She looked up at Rhea, then at Sable, then whispered, "I was wrong." No one heard it, but the horse. But when she turned to go, Sable pawed the dirt once. A single beat, a sound like thunder, in a hollow canyon. Rhea, still dangling by her ankles, felt the vibration before she heard it. And in that strange, suspended moment, her eyes opened clear, defiant, alive. Someone gasped. The town held its breath. The sound of the gasp carried farther than it should have. It reached the steps of the schoolhouse, curled around the corners of the saloon, and even made a drunk old gambler drop his cards. Rhea's eyes were open. She wasn't screaming, wasn't crying, just staring straight at Sable like she was trying to remember how to speak. The sheriff tried to brush it off. "She'll pass out again soon," he grunted. But something had shifted in the air, not just tension, expectation. And then, out of all people, it was Jory Bell who stepped forward. Jory was 17, lanky and sunburnt, usually laughed at for being too soft to be a real man. His pa beat the gentleness out of him with a belt, said he was useless as a book with no words. But now Jory walked out of the barber shop with scissors still in hand and a look in his eyes like he'd seen a war. No one stopped him. He walked up to the fence post, reached behind Rhea's back, and in one careful motion, sliced through the knot with the shears. She dropped hard, her body hit the dirt like a sack of wet flour. She didn't cry out, just gasped and rolled slightly, clutching her ribs with one arm still bound. Jory knelt beside her, took out a handkerchief, and started cutting the ties on her wrists. "This ain't right," he said softly. Not to the crowd, not even to her, just to the earth. The silence that followed was total. Sable stepped back, hooves stamping once. Rhea coughed, winced, and sat up on her elbows, bloody but upright. When Jory tried to help her stand, she slapped his hand away. Not out of cruelty, but dignity. She got to her knees on her own. "I'm not broken," she whispered, voice raw. Then she looked out at the people staring at her, mouths shut, hands still. Some looked away in shame. Others didn't know what to feel. But nobody moved to stop her when she crawled to the trough, dipped her hands into the water, and washed the blood from her face. Sable followed, stood behind her like a shield. Rhea didn't thank them. She didn't weep. She just stood spine cracked, but spirit rising, and faced the town as if daring them to blink first. They had taken nearly everything, her name, her dignity, the breath from her lungs, but they hadn't taken her will. Rhea stood barefoot in the dust spine, bent like a river willow, but eyes steady, dripping water from her chin. When she finally drank from the trough, it wasn't desperation, it was defiance. She dipped both hands, lifted the murky water with trembling fingers, and let it run down her throat, while the entire town watched in silence. Sable stayed beside her, not tethered, not commanded, just present. The preacher looked away, first muttering something about demons, and shuffled back inside the church. Others followed slowly, some in shame, some in fear, but no one spoke a word to her. Not even Marshal Greeley, who stood with fists clenched and mouth pressed flat, could make himself approach. He knew. Everyone did. They had crossed a line that could not be scrubbed clean. Rhea didn't walk away. She moved slowly toward the saloon porch, one step at a time, past the sign that still called her a thief, and picked up the rope that had bound her. She held it for a moment, coiled like a snake in her palm, then draped it over the railing. Not to return it, but to leave it there like a curse someone else would have to lift. Jory stood nearby, unsure if he should speak, when he finally whispered, "What will you do now?" She didn't answer him directly. She turned toward the open land behind the saloon, toward the hills, where the sky widened and the road broke away from town. "I'll find where I was, before they forgot me," she said, "before I forgot myself." That night, Rhea slept beside the fence post where she had hung. Not from weakness, but to mark the place with her waking breath. She curled beneath the shawl left for her by a stranger, one hand resting lightly on Sable's flank, the other tucked under her bruised ribs. She dreamed of drums she hadn't heard since childhood, of fingers weaving herbs into braids, of a time when women knew how to name pain so it wouldn't fester. By morning, the trough was empty, the shawl was gone, and so was Rhea. Only Sable remained standing exactly where he'd been since dawn 2 days before, ears perked toward the east, waiting for no one, but watching everything. Rhea walked for half a day without looking back. The town disappeared behind her like smoke that didn't want to rise. Her feet bled through the dry weeds, but she didn't slow. Every step away from Hollow Creek felt like unpeeling something heavy from her skin. A shame that hadn't been hers, to carry a silence that had grown like mold between her ribs. When she finally stopped, it was at the edge of a narrow creek, the kind only locals knew to follow. When the rain had been kind the season before. There, tucked between cottonwoods and sagebrush, she saw it. A small ring of stones, half swallowed by moss, with bones of an old cooking fire still black in the center. Her mother had brought her here once, long ago. Before white men renamed her clan, before sickness, before silence. Rhea knelt beside the stones, brushed away the dirt, and found beneath it the faint carving of a turtle, her mother's mark. Her own name had come from that story, the one about the turtle who carried the earth on her back but could never be seen crying. Rhea ran her hand across the stone and whispered, "I remember." Then she built a small fire, not for heat, but for memory. She gathered leaves, herbs, wild onions, not to eat yet, but to sort. She pressed roots between her fingers, testing their dryness, naming them out loud. The words came back slowly. Taneka katu nivai. They sounded awkward in her mouth, but beautiful too, like a tongue finding its balance after being cut. That night, Sable found her again. She didn't hear him at first, only felt the earth shift behind her, the heavy exhale of recognition. He had followed her all that way, hoof by hoof, refusing every hand that tried to claim him back. Rhea didn't speak. She just looked at him, then back at the fire, and nodded once. "You can stay." He lowered his head beside her shoulder like an answer. And in that place where no one knew her name, where no one had tied her wrists, or called her a curse, she finally slept under stars that didn't care who was guilty or forgiven, only who could still listen to the land. The townsfolk assumed she'd fled into nothing, into brush and wild, the way exiled women were supposed to vanish, like a mistake never written down. But Sable's absence made it hard to forget. He'd been more than just a prize horse. He'd been the marshal's ego, the town's pride. And now he was gone, not stolen, but walked away of his own will, refusing Rain's commands feed. For a week, no one saw Rhea. Then someone noticed a trail near the South Ridge, bundles of sage tied in a specific pattern along a deer path, the kind used by women who still remembered the old way of leaving signs for each other. Someone else spotted circles burned faint into tree bark, not accidental but intentional, small smoke marks marking safe ground. Rumors turned quiet. The preachers stopped preaching about evil tongues and started coughing again. The blacksmith's wife began boiling water with bitter root leaves Rhea had once traded her, suddenly recalling the instruction to boil it twice. Still, no one dared speak her name, not because they feared her, but because they feared how quickly their shame might answer back. Far beyond the ridge, in a clearing circled by cottonwood and stone, Rhea began to rebuild what she had never owned but had always belonged to. She stacked logs by hand, made crude tools from bones and the iron scraps, used her own spit and ash to bind her cuts. Sable hauled rocks beside her without prompting, stood by the water as she dug narrow trenches to keep the firewood dry. At night she sang, not words but sounds, fragments of lullabies, fragments of prayers. Her voice cracked from disuse, but the canyon didn't care. It echoed her anyway. She didn't plan revenge, didn't pray for apology, she just built. A table, a fire ring, a woven screen of reeds to dry herbs on. One morning she awoke to find 3 chickens pecking at the edge of her cleared ground. No note, just a bundle of seed beside them. She smiled faintly. Somewhere someone still remembered what she'd healed. She said nothing. But she fed the birds and tilled the soil. Not as a return, but as a continuation. Her name wasn't whispered with pity anymore. It wasn't whispered at all. Because out here, it was spoken in full voice. And finally heard. It was the smallest feet that found her, bare, dusty running. She heard them before she saw the boy. Sharp breaths through the cedar trees, snapping twigs in a rhythm too fast for an animal, too light for a grown man. Rhea stood from where she'd been grinding roots and turned slowly, a dried stalk still clutched in her hand. The boy came skidding into the clearing, panting hard, eyes wide and wild. Maybe 8 years old, shirt-torn knees scraped, carrying nothing but a cloth bundle and the smell of fear. "They said you were a witch," he blurted. "But Mama said you healed her feet when the boils came. She said if I ever got lost, I could find the woman with the fire eyes." Rhea didn't speak. She crouched slowly, her own ribs aching from where they had been cracked. The boy's chest heaved. "They sold my sister," he whispered, voice breaking. "I bit the man, then I ran." He held out the bundle like an offering. Rhea unfolded it. Inside were 2 hard biscuits, a strip of cloth with old blood, and a single crow feather. She nodded once. "You ran far," she said softly, the first word she'd spoken in days. The boy nodded, then collapsed at her feet. Sable stepped forward, then nose low, ears forward, not threatening. Curious. The boy flinched at first, then saw the horse's eyes and reached a hand out like he knew how to speak to animals better than people. Rhea lifted the child carefully and carried him to the fire. She made broth from bone and onion, pressed a cold stone against his bruises, and placed the feather above her door. Not as decoration, but recognition. Someone had trusted her again. Someone small, someone brave. That night the boy curled against the horse's belly like a pup beside a warm wall, and Rhea sat watch with a knife in her hand and ash on her cheekbones. Not in fear, but in promise. Tomorrow she would find where the girl had been taken. She would mark a path. She would teach the boy the names of stars and roots and stones that could cut if needed. Not all healing meant softness. Some healing required teeth. And Rhea remembered both now, how to soothe and how to survive. By the time Rhea reached the edge of Whisper Rock, the boy asleep on Sable's back and her pack slung low. The wind had turned hot and dry, carrying the scent of pine smoke from somewhere far off. It reminded her of when the women used to burn cedar to cleanse lies from a house. This wasn't that kind of fire. This one walked upright. She had followed the wagon ruts south for 2 days, reading the broken reeds, the crushed berries, the forgotten boot prints of impatient men. Every trail told a story. Every branch bent sideways spoke of a burdened child. She didn't need a map, only her memory, and the way the earth still bent toward pain. At a trading post near the edge of Lakota land, she asked nothing. She only watched. And then she saw her. A girl maybe 10, too still for her age, sitting behind a crate of boiled corn with her eyes glazed like frost. Rhea walked right up, looked her in the face and said, "Your brother bid a man for you." The girl blinked once, then twice. Then her chin dropped into her chest, as if the tension had been the only thing keeping her upright. A man in a leather coat stepped forward. "That one yours?" he asked, mouth curling. Rhea turned. Her voice was calm. "She is now." The man chuckled, then reached for her arm. Sable stepped between them. No noise, no command, just presence. The man stepped back, raising his hands, suddenly unsure whether the woman or the horse was the one he should fear more. Rhea took the girl's hand, turned her back on the post, and walked. No one followed. That night, as the three of them lay beside a low fire carved into a shallow rock pit, the girl finally spoke. "Mama died from the fever," she said. "They said we were payment." Rhea nodded once, then taught her how to stir ash with a cedar branch to read wind patterns. The boy stirred beside them, muttering in sleep. And for the first time in years, Rhea smiled. Not because she was safe, but because someone else might be now. She was no longer just a woman who'd survived the hanging. She was a fire walking forward, and not one soul dared put her out. They returned to Hollow Creek at dawn. Not in shame, not in secret, but in a slow walk that made every sound louder. The crunch of hooves, the creak of leather, the breath of 2 children who no longer flinched at every sudden noise. Rhea walked at the front, braids looped tight, a bundle of sage strapped across her back, and the old hanging rope coiled loosely at her waist. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder. No one stood in the square to greet them. Not at first, but the sound of Sable's steps on the plank walk echoed like judgment. One by one faces appeared, behind curtains from alleys around corners. Some gasped. Some lowered their gaze, but none dared speak. She walked to the fence post where she had once hung and tied the rope back exactly where it had been. High tight and with a knot still stained red. Then she hung something new beneath it. A bundle of braided grass and cedar. A ribbon torn from the dress of the girl now safe at her side, and a single crow feather from the boy's bundle. Not vengeance, not forgiveness, just truth. Something they'd all see every day. When Marshall Greeley stepped onto the boardwalk, he looked older than she remembered. Smaller somehow. "You ain't got claim here," he said weakly. Rhea met his eyes. "Good," she replied. "I'm not staying," she turned to the crowd. "I came so you'd see what you built doesn't hold." Then she looked down at the children, both of whom now stood beside her, silent but unshaking. "You taught them to be quiet. I taught them to plant." With that, she walked away through the center of town, through every shadow that had once tried to swallow her. They passed the saloon where Jory Bell watched from the doorway, nodding once with a hand over his heart. They passed the church where the preacher's wife held her breath. And when they reached the tree line, the girl turned to look back. "Are we free now?" she asked. Rhea looked forward toward the clearing they'd call home. "We're fed," she said. "That's how it starts." Behind them, the rope swayed in the morning wind, but no one dared touch it. Not again. Please like, share, and subscribe for more true-hearted tales here on Echoes of the West. If you had seen her tie that rope back herself, would you have looked away or stepped beside her? Tell us in the comments.